She was just a librarian. No power, no money, no fame. Yet tonight, in the gilded banquet hall, where the world's most dangerous crime bosses stood with glasses in hand, the most powerful woman in the room suddenly froze. The glass fell to the floor. Tears streamed down a face that had never cried before. And the entire room, hundreds of men who had ordered murders without batting an eye, fell into complete silence. They all looked in one direction, towards the librarian in the ivory dress borrowed from a friend. Something buried for 20 years had come alive again, and tonight, blood would be shed for it. Welcome to my story. If you want to follow to the end, like now, and comment the name of the city you're watching, so I know how far my story has traveled in this world. The ballroom smelled like money and threat. That was the first thing Lenora Vale noticed when the car door opened and she stepped out onto the stone-paved driveway of the Harcastle estate. Not the chandeliers burning gold through the arched windows, not the women moving past in dresses that cost more than her annual salary, not even the men standing at the perimeter with their hands folded in front of them in the way that meant they were armed and patient. She noticed the smell, something beneath the cologne and fresh-cut flowers and expensive candles. Something older, something that lived in the back of the throat and stayed there. She almost got back in the car. She would have if the driver hadn't already pulled away. Lenora stood on the steps of a building she had no business standing in front of, holding a leather portfolio case containing notes she had spent 72 hours preparing, wearing a dress that belonged to her friend Cassie and was 2 inches too long in the hem. She had pinned it up in the cab. The pin was already coming loose. She could feel it shifting against her hip as she moved toward the entrance. The invitation in her portfolio read, Dr. Harlan Mott, Keynote Historian, Harcastle Benefit Gala. Dr. Mott's name, not hers. Dr. Mott had called her at 6 that morning. His voice was strange, tight. He had told her he was ill, that he couldn't make it, that she knew the material better than anyone, and she was the only person he trusted to present in his place. He had told her the speech was already arranged, that the organizers knew she would be substituting, that it would be fine. He had said it will be fine 3 times. Men only said that when it wasn't going to be fine. She had tried to call him back at noon. No answer. At 3. No answer. She had called the university and been told that Dr. Mott had not come in that day and had not called to report his absence, which was unlike him, and that they were attempting to reach him. She almost called the number on the invitation to cancel. She didn't know why she hadn't. She still didn't know, standing here on these steps, her pin slipping and her palms damp inside the portfolio handle. Maybe because she had spent 72 hours on those notes, and the thought of them going nowhere sat wrong in her chest. Maybe because Dr. Mott had sounded genuinely frightened, and she had the irrational feeling that showing up mattered somehow, that it was a thing she owed him without being able to explain why. Maybe she was just stubborn in the precise direction that caused her the most problems. She went inside. The foyer alone was larger than the entire floor of the branch library where she worked. Marble underfoot, the real kind with the gray veins running through it, the kind that made your footsteps sound like small accusations. A woman at the reception table found her name, Mott's name, on a list and handed her a laminated lanyard with the word presenter, printed in clean serif type. A man in a black jacket materialized from somewhere and offered to take her coat. She didn't have a coat. He nodded and disappeared. Another man appeared. Young, clean-shaven. He introduced himself as the event coordinator and walked her through the evening schedule in the efficient, slightly condescending way of someone who had long ago concluded that speakers were fundamentally a problem to be managed. She would present at 9:15. The speech was to run 40 minutes, questions at the discretion of the floor. She should keep her remarks tasteful and non-political. He said non-political with a particular emphasis that she would later understand was a warning she had no context to decode. He left her at the edge of the ballroom. She stood there and tried to read the room the way she read everything, carefully, from the margins in. There were perhaps 200 people. The seating arrangements were circular, clustered around tables draped in white linen, each table holding a different configuration of power that she couldn't fully parse but could feel. Groups that didn't mingle with other groups, men who watched the room instead of the people they were talking to, women who wore their composure like body armor. There was conversation everywhere, the ambient hum of it, but underneath it ran something else. something vigilant, like a room full of people who trusted no one in the room, including whoever they were currently talking to. Lenora had grown up moving between 8 different foster homes before she aged out of the system. She had learned, young, to read rooms like this. Not ballrooms. Kitchens. Living rooms where adults sat and smiled in ways that didn't reach their faces. Spaces where the real rules were never posted anywhere you could find them, but you paid for not knowing them anyway. She recognized this feeling. She moved toward the bar because she needed something to do with her hands, and because standing at the margin of a room like this with nothing to hold made her feel like a target. She ordered sparkling water. The bartender gave her a look that was perfectly neutral in the practiced way that meant he'd seen everything and remembered none of it. She took her glass and turned back to the room. That was when she saw the woman. She was standing near the far window, separate from the nearest cluster of guests by about 6 feet of open floor that no one seemed inclined to cross. Not young, not old, somewhere in the territory where good bone structure and absolute self-possession made age irrelevant. Dark hair. A gown the color of charcoal that didn't glitter or draw attention. It simply existed with the certainty of something that didn't need to perform. She was holding a glass of red wine in one hand and talking to a man in a gray suit, and something about the way she talked, the economy of it, the stillness of her face while her eyes moved, communicated that she was not having a conversation. She was conducting an assessment. Lenora looked away. She was not the kind of person who stared. She found a spot near one of the columns and reviewed her notes. The speech covered the lost city archives of the Valanthi trading empire, a relatively obscure historical subject that Dr. Moti had spent 30 years researching. She had edited his last 4 manuscripts and knew the material well enough to present it, but she was not an expert, and in a room full of people who presumably cared enough about history to sponsor a benefit event around it, she was aware of exactly how thin the ice was. She tried to focus on the notes. She kept feeling watched. The third time she looked up, the woman from the window was looking directly at her. Not glancing, not scanning the room. Looking at her with the fixed quality of someone who had been looking for some time and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. The distance was maybe 40 feet. Across that distance, across the moving bodies and the ambient noise and the candlelight, the woman's expression was completely unreadable. Lenora looked back at her notes. Her pulse had picked up for no reason she could explain. At 9 o'clock, the coordinator reappeared and steered her toward the small, raised platform at the room's far end. The audience settled with the rustling efficiency of people accustomed to scheduled events. Lenora adjusted the microphone, opened her portfolio on the lectern, and looked out at 200 faces she didn't know. She thought about Dr. Mott's voice on the phone. "It will be fine." She started talking. For the first 20 minutes, she was just herself. Careful, precise, a little too flat in her delivery because public speaking was not something she loved, but knowledgeable in the way that came through regardless of delivery. She walked them through the Valanthi archive discoveries, the recovered trade ledgers, the fragments of a cultural record that had been systematically buried when the empire's successor states decided certain truths about commerce and conflict were better unremembered. Then she reached the third section of her notes. Dr. Mott had flagged these passages differently from the rest. A small red asterisk in the margin, which was his notation for handle carefully, verify source. She had verified them 3 weeks ago against the original journal fragments in the university's secure collection, unpublished material, never publicly presented. The journal of a Valanthi merchant who had documented, in devastating detail, exactly how the archive destruction had been orchestrated, and by whom, and for how much money. She quoted the journal. She heard the room shift before she understood why. It wasn't a sound exactly, more a change in the quality of the silence. The particular silence of people who have stopped performing attention and started paying it. She could feel it on her skin. She kept reading because stopping mid-quote would be worse, because her voice was level and her hands were not shaking, and she was going to finish what she had started. She finished the passage. She looked up. The man at the third table from the left had gone completely still. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, the kind of face that appeared on the boards of foundations and the donor walls of hospitals. He was looking at the woman 2 tables away from him, not Lenora, but the other man sitting there, a heavy-set figure with rings on 3 fingers. And whatever passed between them in that look had the quality of a message sent in a language Lenora couldn't read. She moved on. She finished the lecture. The applause was appropriate, measured, the kind that fulfilled a social obligation without expressing anything genuine. She stepped down from the platform. She was collecting her notes when she heard the glass shatter. Not dropped. Shattered. The sound of something hitting marble floor with force, the way a thing breaks when the hand holding it has suddenly stopped functioning. Lenora turned toward the sound. The woman from the window was standing 6 feet from where she'd been before. She was standing very still in the aftermath of the broken glass, looking at Lenora, and her face, the face of a woman who had, over the course of this evening, maintained the exact same controlled expression through 200 people and 3 hours of social performance, was no longer controlled. There were tears on it, not welling, running, the kind of tears that don't ask permission. The room noticed. Of course the room noticed. 200 people whose entire existence in a space like this depended on noticing everything. The conversation around them didn't stop all at once, but it thinned rapidly, the way a crowd parts around something it doesn't understand but recognizes as significant. Within 30 seconds, the area around the woman had gone quiet, and that quiet spread outward in a ring, and the ring kept spreading until Lenora could hear the chandeliers. No one spoke. The woman was still looking at her. Lenora had no idea what to do. She stood with her portfolio half closed in her hands and looked back because there was nothing else to do. Because the entire room was watching, and leaving was not an option without crossing directly through that silence. The woman's mouth moved. Not loud enough to carry. Not meant to. Lenora read it anyway, or thought she did, because she had spent a childhood learning to read mouths from across rooms when the words being said were not meant for her ears. 2 syllables. A name. Not Lenora. Something else. The silver-haired man at the third table had taken out his phone. He was already texting someone. And outside the ballroom's tall windows, in the manicured dark of the estate grounds, something moved through the hedgerow that was not a garden employee and did not walk like one. Lenora Vale had spent 31 years being invisible. She understood, in the way you understand something when your body knows before your mind catches up. The cold drop of certainty in the sternum, the sudden animal alertness in the hands, that she was not invisible anymore. She didn't know why. She didn't know what the woman had seen when she looked at her. She didn't know what name had been on those lips. But the man with the phone had stopped texting and was now watching her with the particular patience of someone who has issued instructions and is waiting for them to be carried out. And the woman with the tears on her face had started moving toward her through the parted crowd. And the expression she wore now was not grief anymore. It was something more complicated than grief. It was the face of a person who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just found it in a place they had stopped expecting to look. And who knows, with the certainty of long experience, exactly how dangerous that kind of finding can be. Lenora held her portfolio against her chest like it was something she could hide behind. The woman crossed the last 10 feet between them and stopped. Up close, her eyes were a pale, severe gray, the kind of eyes that had looked at a great number of things and made decisions about all of them. She said, very quietly, so that only Lenora could hear, "Where did you get those journal passages?" Not a question. The syntax of a question without the intonation of one. Lenora's mouth was dry. "The university's archive collection. They're unpublished fragments from—" "No." The woman's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "They were destroyed. I watched them burn." Lenora stared at her. "That's not possible. I authenticated them myself. The provenance chain goes back to—" "I know the provenance chain." Something shifted in the gray eyes. "I built it." The ballroom was still watching. The man with the phone had put it away. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, in the dark of the Harcastle grounds, whatever had been moving through the hedgerow had stopped. Waiting. "My name," the woman said, "is Seraphine Voss." She said it the way people say something they expect to be recognized, not with vanity, but with the practical expectation that recognition will change the conversation. Lenora didn't recognize the name. She said so. Something moved across Seraphine Voss's face that was almost, in some other life, amusement. "Then you are either the bravest person in this room," Seraphine said, "or you have been kept very carefully in the dark." She tilted her head, that gray gaze traveling over Lenora's face with the quality of someone taking inventory. Tell me your name, your full name. Lenora Vale. Where were you born? I don't know. A pause. You don't know where you were born? I grew up in foster care. The records from my placement there are gaps. The social workers told me the original documentation was lost in a county archive flood when I was 7. Lenora heard herself giving this information to a stranger in a ballroom and understood in real time how strange that was. She stopped. Why are you asking me this? Seraphine Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, because you just quoted word for word from a journal that was burned in a warehouse fire 22 years ago. A fire I arranged myself. A fire that was supposed to eliminate every copy of those records from existence. She stepped slightly closer. And because you have her eyes. Lenora said, whose eyes? Seraphine Voss didn't answer. Behind her, across the ballroom, the silver-haired man had risen from his table. He was moving toward the exit with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has set something in motion and sees no reason to watch it happen. Seraphine's gaze moved past Lenora's shoulder, just for a second. The thing that crossed her face in that second was not fear. Lenora would have said this woman had burned fear out of herself sometime in her distant past, but it was close to it. It was the face of someone performing a rapid calculation and not liking the answer. Don't go back to your table, Seraphine said. Don't speak to anyone, don't check your phone, don't go outside. Her voice was still quiet, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something pressurized. Stay within 10 feet of me for the remainder of this evening. Can you do that? I don't understand what's happening. No, Seraphine said. You don't. That's the problem. She turned partially away, signaling something to someone Lenora couldn't identify in the crowd with a gesture so small it was barely a movement. Lenora stood in the center of the most expensive room she had ever entered, in a dress held together with a safety pin that was coming loose, holding notes for a speech she had just finished delivering, and understood that something had shifted in the architecture of her life in a way she couldn't yet map. She didn't know whose eyes she had. She didn't know what name Seraphine Voss had said when the glass broke. She didn't know why a journal she had authenticated in a university archive had been burned 22 years ago by the woman now standing beside her. What she knew was the feeling in her chest. The same feeling she'd carried from foster home to foster home, from city to city, through 31 years of a life that had always felt like it was missing a first chapter. The feeling that some things about her existence didn't fit together the way they should, that the gaps in her records weren't accidental gaps, that someone, somewhere, had decided something about her life before she was old enough to have a say in it. And standing in this ballroom with Seraphine Voss's people moving into position in the crowd around her, and the silver-haired man disappearing through the exit, and the darkness beyond the windows holding its breath, Lenora Vale began to understand that whatever decision had been made about her life 20-some years ago was not finished. It was just now arriving to collect what it was owed. Seraphine didn't touch her. That was the first thing Lenora noticed about the way the woman operated. She didn't grab, didn't steer, didn't make contact the way people did when they were trying to control a situation through physical assertion. She simply moved, and the expectation that Lenora would move with her was communicated through something other than force, through the architecture of her body. The way she angled herself so that staying still would mean being left alone in the middle of a room that had, in the last 4 minutes, started to feel like a closing hand. Lenora moved with her. They crossed the ballroom in the direction of the east corridor, and the crowd parted in the same way it had parted before. Not because people stepped aside consciously, but because something in Seraphine Voss's forward motion communicated that not stepping aside would be a decision with consequences. Lenora kept pace. She kept her portfolio pressed to her chest and her eyes moving the way she'd learned to keep her eyes moving in spaces that weren't safe, cataloging exits and bodies, and the positions of the men who were trying not to look like they were watching. There were 4 of them that she could identify. Maybe more she couldn't. The east corridor was long and dim, lit by sconces spaced too far apart, the carpet a deep wine red that swallowed sound. Seraphine walked to the third door on the left and opened it without knocking. which told Lenora it was either empty or contained someone who expected her. It was a study. Dark wood, bookshelves, a desk that hadn't been used for actual work in some time. 2 men inside. One was large, mid-40s, standing near the window with his arms loose at his sides in the way of someone who spent a lot of time being ready. The other was seated, younger, narrow-faced, a laptop open in front of him, and the kind of focused stillness that came from looking at something that required concentration. Seraphine closed the door. "Niels," she said to the seated one. The journal passages she quoted, cross-reference against the Arden documentation. The man named Niels didn't look up. "Already started." "How long?" 10 minutes. Maybe 8. Seraphine moved to the side of the desk and stood there. She didn't sit. She looked at Lenora, who was standing near the door because that was the position she'd arrived in and she hadn't been given a reason to move from it. "Sit down," Seraphine said. "I'm fine standing." A pause. "That wasn't concern for your comfort." Lenora sat. The large man by the window hadn't moved or spoken. He was looking at Lenora with an expression that wasn't hostile exactly, but wasn't anything warmer than that. The kind of look that was performing an assessment and had no investment in what the assessment found. "Your name before Vale," Seraphine said. "What was it?" "Vale is my legal name. It was assigned during my second foster placement. I don't have another one on record." "What do you remember before the second placement?" "Not much. I was 4, maybe 5. The first placement, I have images. A kitchen with yellow walls, a woman who wore her hair in a braid. I don't have names." "Do you have any documentation from before the second placement?" "No." Lenora heard the flatness in her own voice. She'd answered these questions before, in social worker offices, in a therapist's room when she was 19 and trying to build something that made sense out of a past that didn't. "There was a fire, county records office I was told it was in Delaney County. 2001. A lot of placement files from that period were lost." "Delaney County," Seraphine repeated. Something changed in the room, not visible, felt, like a pressure shift. The man by the window moved for the first time. Not much, just a slight reorientation of his weight, the way a person adjusts when something they expected to be hypothetical becomes concrete. "That's where the clinic was," he said. His voice was low, flat. He wasn't talking to Lenora. "Yes," Seraphine said. She was still looking at Lenora. "It is." Lenora looked between them. "What clinic?" Nobody answered that. "What clinic?" she said again, harder. Seraphine turned to the window for a moment. When she turned back, the grief that had cracked her face open in the ballroom was gone, packed back down somewhere underneath the controlled surface. But the controlled surface was thinner now. Lenora could see the effort in it. 23 years ago, Seraphine said, a woman I worked with went into a private clinic in Delaney County under a false name. She was 8 months pregnant. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a safe location for the delivery, after which she would relocate and resume her work. She stopped. She never relocated. What happened to her? She was killed. No softening in the delivery, no pause around it. Or we believe she was killed. The clinic reported a fire, structural collapse. The records, the physical records, were destroyed. We recovered enough to confirm she had been there. We could not confirm anything about the delivery. Lenore's mouth was dry. What does this have to do with me? She was pregnant with twins. The room was very quiet. Nils's fingers had stopped moving on the keyboard. The clinic reported 1 infant, stillborn. Seraphine's jaw tightened. We had no reason to doubt it. The woman was dead. The records were gone. We buried what we could recover of her and we... She stopped again. This stop was different from the others. Longer. We stopped looking. Lenora was aware of her own breathing, the way it had gone shallow without her telling it to. You think I don't think anything yet. Seraphine's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. Lenora could tell because the slight tightening around her eyes suggested she'd heard it too. I'm waiting for data. Then why are you telling me this? Because we have approximately 20 minutes before the men Magnus Reeve just contacted arrive at this estate, And I need you to understand the shape of the situation before that happens. The name landed in the room like something physical. Nils's stillness sharpened. The man by the window turned fully toward Seraphine for the first time. Reeve made contact, the window man said. Not a question. He texted from the table. I saw his screen when I crossed behind him. Seraphine moved to the desk, leaned over Nils's shoulder, looked at his screen. He recognized the journal passages. He was there when they were compiled. He knows what their existence means. What does their existence mean? Lenore said. Nobody answered. I'm sitting in a room with people I don't know because a woman I'd never met before tonight told me to follow her, and now someone I've never heard of is apparently sending people here to do something that you're all treating like a significant threat, and I would like someone to tell me what is actually happening. Her voice was level. It surprised her. Now, please. Seraphine straightened. Seraphine. She looked at Lenora for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. The journal passages you quoted, she said, they were part of a larger document, a record kept by a woman named Elise Arden, who spent 6 years inside Magnus Reeve's organization documenting his operations. What Reeve does, what he has done for 30 years, is manufacture conflict between independent criminal organizations. He identifies fault lines, old grievances, disputed territories, succession disputes. He funds both sides. He sells weapons to both sides. He profits from the war, and then when both sides are weakened enough, he brokers the peace and takes a structural position in whatever survives. She paused. He has done this across 4 continents. The document Elise compiled would have exposed every transaction, every contact, every name. And Elise Arden was the woman you said was killed. Yes. The woman who was pregnant. Yes. Lenora put her portfolio down on the arm of the chair. She needed her hands free. She didn't know why. It was a physical instinct, the same one that had made her catalog exits when she walked into the ballroom. And the journal passages I used tonight, where did they actually come from? You said you burned them. I burned every copy I knew about. Seraphine's voice was careful now in a new way. Elise was thorough. She had been thorough about everything else. It's possible she created redundancies I wasn't aware of. Hidden copies, routed through the archive system under cover documentation. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite admiration, but the memory of it. It would be like her. Nils, the window man spoke without turning. Cross-reference is done? Almost. A pause, keyboard sound. Yeah, it's done. Nils leaned back. He wasn't looking at his screen anymore. He was looking at Lenora. The passages she quoted matched the Arden source document at 97% accuracy. The variance is minor phrasing differences consistent with transcription by a second party. Seraphine said nothing. The window man said nothing. The silence lasted long enough that Lenora became aware of the sound of the Gala continuing on the other side of the wall. Muffled conversation, a string quartet she hadn't noticed until now. The collective performance of a world that had no idea what was happening in this room. 97%, Lenora said, because no one else was saying anything. Yes, Nils said. What does that mean? Nils glanced at Seraphine. Seraphine gave him nothing. He looked back at Lenora. It means whoever archived those journal fragments for the university had access to the original Arden document, or to someone who had read it closely enough to reproduce it with minor variations. It means, the window man said, that whoever buried those passages in a university archive did it deliberately. As a record. A backup. He paused. And it means someone wanted them to surface eventually, at the right moment, in the right place. Tonight, Lenora said. Tonight. He nodded. In front of the people in that ballroom, some of whom Reeve has been manipulating for 20 years and who just heard for the first time that a documented record of his operations exists. Lenora sat with that. She was a librarian. She was good at sitting with information and letting it organize itself into a shape. She was also good at identifying the point at which information stopped being abstract and started being immediate. He's going to want to know where the university got those fragments. Yes. Which means he's going to want to talk to the person who presented them. Yes. Tonight. The men he contacted will be here and... Seraphine checked something on her phone. 15 minutes, possibly less. Lenora looked at her hands. They were steady. She didn't entirely understand why they were steady, given that her chest felt like something had been compressed inside it, but they were steady, and she was going to work with that. What were you planning to do? Get you out of the building, Seraphine said. There are tunnels beneath the east wing. They exit onto the grounds half a kilometer from the main gate. I have a car staged at the secondary road. And after that? After that, I need to know everything. Every detail of how you came to work with Mott, how he acquired those fragments, how long they've been in the archive, who else knew about them. You think Dr. Mott? I think Dr. Mott disappeared this morning for a reason. Seraphine's voice was flat, and I think that reason is connected to what happened in that ballroom tonight. The cold thing in Lenora's chest got colder. She had tried to call him 3 times. No answer. She thought about his voice on the phone. It will be fine, the particular tightness of it. She thought about the fact that he'd called her instead of canceling the event outright, and she hadn't let herself think about why until right now, until the shape of it resolved into something she didn't want to look at directly. He had sent her because he couldn't be here, and he couldn't be here because someone already knew he had the fragments. I need to make a call, she said. No. Seraphine was already moving toward the bookshelf on the south wall. No calls, no signals. Reeves' people will be monitoring outgoing communications from this building as soon as they have eyes on it, and they may have started already. I have to know if he's... I understand. And for a moment, just a moment, Seraphine's voice lost its operational quality and became something else, something that had lived a long time with the specific grief of not knowing. But making that call right now will not tell you anything useful, and may tell them exactly where you are. Lenora closed her mouth. Seraphine pressed something on the bookshelf and a section of it swung inward, not dramatically, not with the theatrical weight of something designed for show, but with the practical easiness of something that had been used many times. The air that came through the gap was cool and smelled of stone and old damp. Cale. She looked at the window man. Take the north exit. Create the impression that I'm still in the ballroom for as long as possible. You have maybe 12 minutes before that becomes untenable. The man named Cale moved toward the door. He didn't look at Lenora. At the door, he stopped. The resemblance is real, he said. He wasn't talking to Seraphine. He was talking to Lenora. I knew Elise Arden for 7 years. I don't say this lightly. Then he was gone. Lenora stood up. Niels was already shutting down the laptop, pulling a drive from its port. He moved efficiently, without haste, the practiced way of someone who had done this, the specific routine of we are leaving and leaving nothing behind, more times than was comfortable to think about. The DNA sample, Niels said, pocketing the drive. We'll need a comparison point. I have the preserved evidence from the original investigation. Seraphine looked at Lenora. A blood sample from the clinic site. It was the only biological material we recovered that could be conclusively attributed to Elise. She paused. If you're willing. Lenora looked at the open section of bookshelf, the darkness beyond it, the smell of old stone. She had spent 31 years with a gap in her life where the beginning should have been. She had spent 31 years being told the records were lost, the files were gone, the flood destroyed everything, and accepting it because she had no choice but to accept it, because the alternative was building an entire life around a question that had no answer. She thought about what Seraphine had said. 1 child died according to official records. She thought about the yellow kitchen, the woman with the braid. She thought about Dr. Mott, who had called her this morning with fear in his voice and sent her here instead of coming himself. And she thought maybe he had known something. Maybe he had built something into his archive acquisition specifically because he'd known he might not be the one to deliver it. Maybe he'd known, for longer than she had, that this wasn't about the Villanthi trading empire at all. Maybe it will be fine had been the only way he could think to say, I'm sorry for what I'm sending you into. She picked up her portfolio. Yes, she said, I'm willing. She walked through the bookshelf. Behind her, Seraphine pulled it closed. The darkness of the tunnel swallowed the light from the study in pieces. The edge of the bookshelf frame, the thin line of warmth underneath it, and then nothing. Niels had a light, small, directional, not much. Enough. The tunnel floor was stone, uneven, the walls close enough that Lenore's shoulder brushed the right side when she walked. Seraphine moved behind her. No one spoke. They were 50 meters in when the sound reached them. Distant, muffled by the estate's stone floors above, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever been in a space where it happened. A shout. Then another. Then the specific shattering percussion of something that wasn't a door slamming and wasn't furniture falling. Nils stopped. Lenore stopped behind him. Seraphine's hand came to Lenore's shoulder, not roughly, but with the decisive pressure of someone communicating, "Don't move." They stood in the tunnel and listened to what was happening above them, and Lenora understood, in the particular clarity of a moment when the body strips everything down to essentials, that whatever she'd walked into tonight had already moved past the point of her leaving and going home and pretending she hadn't been at the Harcastle estate. Reeves' people hadn't waited 15 minutes. They were already inside. Seraphine's hand stayed on Lenore's shoulder for 3 seconds. Then it was gone and she was moving past Lenore in the dark, past Niels, forward along the tunnel in the direction they'd been heading, and her voice came back low and without inflection, the voice of someone running calculations while their body was already in motion. "Keep moving. Don't stop for sound." Niels went. Lenore went. The sounds from above continued. Not sustained gunfire, son. Not yet. Individual reports, spaced out, the kind of noise that came from something controlled rather than something panicked. Methodical. That was worse than panicked. Panicked meant people making decisions under fear. Methodical meant people executing a plan they'd already made. Lenore counted her steps because it was something to do with her mind that wasn't imagining what was happening in the ballroom above them. She got to 40 before the tunnel curved left and the grade shifted downward, the floor going from cut stone to something older and rougher beneath her shoes. The borrowed dress caught on something in the dark, a protrusion from the wall, a rusted bracket, and she heard the fabric tear. She kept moving. The pin at her hip had come all the way loose now. She could feel the hem dragging against the floor on her left side, but stopping to deal with it was not a thing that was going to happen. Nils's light bobbed ahead of her. Seraphine was a presence at her back, close enough that Lenore could hear her breathing, which was controlled, and even in the way that took training to maintain. "How long is this tunnel?" Lenore said, quietly. "Another 400 meters to the exit chamber," Seraphine said. "Then a locked door. Nils has the key. And after the door. 50 meters of open ground to the tree line. The car is another 300 meters through the trees on the service road." Open ground. Lenore processed that. If Reeves' people were already inside the estate, some of them would be outside, covering exits. That was how you ran an operation like this. Yet, you didn't just go through the front, you sealed the perimeter first, and then you went through the front. She said this. Seraphine said, "I know. So the open ground is a problem, yes. Do you have a solution?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that Seraphine was deciding how much to say. "Kale will create a disturbance at the north exit. It should draw attention in that direction." "Should?" "Yes, should." Lenore accepted this because she had no alternative to accepting it, and she was learning, in real time, that this was the operational texture of the world Seraphine Voss inhabited. Not certainty, but calibrated probability, and the willingness to move on probability when certainty wasn't available. She had spent her adult life in a library. Certainty was the whole point of a library. Sources, citations, verified chains of evidence, the comfort of knowing that what you were holding was true. She was a long way from the library. The tunnel curved again, right this time, and opened into a wider space. Not a room exactly, more a natural widening in the passage. The walls rougher here, the ceiling higher. Nils stopped. In the circle of his light, Lenore could see a door set into the far wall. Heavy, iron-framed, the wood dark with age. A modern padlock through an old hasp. The combination of old and new infrastructure that spoke of a tunnel that had existed for a long time and been quietly maintained by people who found old tunnels useful. Nils was already working the lock. His hands were steady. The lock opened. He pulled the door. The air that came through was cold and smelled like wet grass and night, and after the enclosed stone of the tunnel, it hit Lenore's face like something physical, like a hand pressing against her. She breathed it. Beyond the door. A concrete channel, maybe 2 meters wide, the kind of drainage infrastructure that existed beneath the grounds of large old estates and never appeared on any modern map. A low ceiling, faint ambient light from a grate somewhere above, the cold blue of a night sky with cloud cover. Not much, just enough to see outlines. They moved through the channel without the flashlight. Nils killed it before they stepped through the door. 40 meters, 50. Lenore counted. The channel ended at a grate in the ground above, and beside it a rusted ladder bolted to the concrete wall. Nils went up first. He pressed himself against the top rung and pushed the grate with both hands, slow and controlled, letting it up an inch, 2 inches, and held it there while he scanned. 15 seconds. He pushed the grate up and over, climbed out. Lenore went next. The ladder rungs were cold and the borrowed dress made the climb awkward, the torn hem catching her foot on the third rung, and she yanked it free and kept going and came up out of the ground into the dark of an open lawn with the estate's lit windows visible maybe 200 meters to the north. She could hear voices from that direction, not calm voices. Seraphine came up behind her and was on her feet before Lenore had fully oriented. She was already looking north, reading the light patterns in the windows, reading something in the shapes of the shadows moving behind the glass. "Kale," she said, quietly. "Not to anyone." Then, "Move. Tree line. Don't run." Don't run because running across open ground triggered a different kind of attention than walking. Lenora knew this. She walked. The grass was wet. The sound of the estate had changed. What had been the muffled noise of a contained disturbance was moving towards something less contained. More voices. Something breaking. The specific quality of an event that was no longer controllable by the people who'd organized it. She didn't look at the windows. She watched the tree line, and she walked, and she kept her breathing even, and she thought about nothing except the next few meters of wet grass in front of her. 60 meters. A light swept across the lawn from the right. A flashlight, from somewhere near the estate's east corner. Seraphine put a hand on Lenora's arm without breaking stride, a slight downward pressure, and Lenora understood and slowed her walk further, made herself smaller in the dark, kept moving. The light swept back. Didn't stop on them. 90 meters. They reached the trees. The service road was where Seraphine had said it would be. The car was where she'd said it would be. Dark-colored, engine off, no lights. A second person was in the driver's seat, someone Lenora hadn't met, a woman with cropped hair who had the engine running before Seraphine had fully closed the rear door. They moved. No lights until they hit the public road 2 kilometers away, and then just the normal low beams of a car going nowhere in particular. The estate disappeared behind a curve in the road, and Lenora felt the tension in her own shoulders only because it shifted, not because it released. She looked down at her hands in her lap, still steady. She didn't know what that said about her. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Nils was in the front seat, laptop open again, the screen's light making his face look hollow. Seraphine was beside Lenora in the back, looking at her phone, and her expression had closed back down into the operational blankness that Lenora was starting to recognize as the face she wore when she was processing things she didn't intend to show. "Kale," Lenora said. Seraphine didn't look up from her phone. "He knows the contingencies." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "He'll reach the secondary rally point if he can. If he can't—" She stopped. Kale has been in worse situations. Lenora accepted this also. The car drove. Outside, the road was empty and dark, the kind of rural darkness that came from genuine absence of people rather than just absence of lights. They were maybe 10 minutes out from the estate when Nils said, from the front, "I've got the DNA comparison protocol initialized. I'll need the biological sample from the archive." "I have it." Seraphine reached inside her jacket and produced a small sealed case, the kind used for medical transport. She held it for a moment before she passed it forward. Lenora watched her hold it. There was something in the way she held it that wasn't operational, something that had nothing to do with evidence or confirmation. The way a person held something they had carried for a very long time without quite letting themselves look at directly. "How long have you had that?" Lenora said. 22 years. Seraphine passed it to Nils and looked out the window. "I took it from the clinic site myself." Before I arranged the fire. You arranged the fire at the clinic. Yes. Why? Because Reeves' people were 40 minutes behind me, and the clinic had Elise's real name in its patient records, and I could not allow them to confirm she had ever been there. She said this without looking at Lenora. I recovered what I could recover. I destroyed what I couldn't carry. Lenora sat with the shape of that for a moment. And if there had been a second child, a living child, Seraphine said nothing. You would have destroyed the record of that too. The silence stretched long enough to be an answer. I didn't know, Seraphine said finally. The clinic had recorded one infant, stillborn. I had no reason. She stopped, started again. I had 40 minutes, and a woman I loved was dead, and I made decisions that I have made peace with. Or I had made peace with them. Until tonight. Lenora looked out her own window. The dark outside was moving past at a steady rate, and she watched it and thought about what it meant to have your origin story be an act of destruction by someone trying to protect something else. Thought about the fire in Delaney County that everyone had told her was an accident, the county records office, the flood, the lost files. All the clean administrative explanations for why there was nothing at the beginning of her life. None of it accidental. All of it by design. The question was whose design? They drove for another 20 minutes and then turned onto a road that wasn't on any map Lenora would have recognized. A private lane, gravel, bordered by old growth that closed overhead. A property at the end of it. Not large. A working farmhouse that had been modified into something else. The modification subtle but present. Window placements that suggested reinforced glass. Exterior lighting positioned for surveillance rather than aesthetics. The faint outline of a secondary structure set back in the trees. The driver cut the engine in a gravel yard. They went inside. The interior was utilitarian. Clean, but without any interest in comfort beyond the functional. A central room with a table, a bank of equipment along one wall, 2 doors leading to spaces Lenora hadn't seen. It smelled like coffee and circulated air, the smell of a place that was occupied continuously by people who didn't spend time making it feel like somewhere you'd want to stay. Niels went directly to the equipment. The driver, still unnamed, still silent, went through one of the doors and didn't come back. Seraphine stood in the center of the room and looked at Lenora. The sample will take time, she said. The comparison protocol requires 6 hours minimum for a reliable result. 6 hours. Yes. Lenora looked at the table. There was a chair. She sat in it, not because she was told to this time, but because her legs had decided, independently, that they had done enough for the moment. While we wait, tell me about her. Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair across the table and sat in it. And for the first time since Lenora had seen her, she looked like something other than a force of organized will. She looked tired. Not physically tired, the other kind. She was careful, Seraphine said. Elise, the most careful person I have ever worked with, and I have worked with people whose survival depended on it. She put both hands flat on the table. She noticed things, small things. She would walk into a room and within 5 minutes she knew things about the people in it that they didn't know about themselves. It was irritating sometimes. She was almost always right. How did she end up inside Reeves' organization? She built her way in. Over 4 years, she created an identity, built a reputation, made herself useful to the right people. By the time she was close enough to document what she was actually after, she had been living the cover for so long that... Seraphine stopped. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was remembering every day which things she actually believed and which things were the cover. When you say the same things long enough, they start to feel true. And the pregnancy. The hands on the table moved slightly, adjusted. She told me when she was 5 months along. She hadn't known, or hadn't let herself know, until it was too late for certain options. The father was... She paused for the first time in a way that felt like it was about more than finding the right words. Someone who shouldn't have existed in her life. A complication she hadn't planned for. Someone inside Reeves' organization. Someone adjacent to it. Seraphine's jaw tightened. The details of that are... She looked at the equipment bank where Niels was working. They're relevant. I'll tell you. But not tonight. Lenora filed that. The way she filed things in the library. Not discarded, not immediately pursued, but tagged and set aside until the moment when it would connect to something else. The journal, she said. The passages I quoted tonight. You said she must have created redundancies you didn't know about. Hidden copies routed through the archive system. Yes. But you arranged the destruction of all physical records. Of everything I knew about, yes. Lenora put her palms on the table, mirroring Seraphine's posture without intending to. Dr. Mott has been building his archive collection for 30 years. He's not a reckless man. He's not a man who would acquire fragments without understanding where they came from. She looked at Seraphine directly. Someone gave them to him deliberately. Someone who knew what they were and wanted them to surface through him in an academic context, at a specific type of event. Seraphine was very still. Someone who knew about the gala, Lenora said, who knew the right people would be in the room, who knew that if those passages were presented publicly in front of witnesses, Magnus Reeve couldn't simply make them disappear. She paused. Someone who planned this. Yes, Seraphine said. I had reached that conclusion. Who else knew about Elise's archive work, outside your organization? Very few people. Seraphine's voice had gone careful. The operation was compartmentalized. Elise reported to me directly. Below me, 3 people had operational knowledge. Cale, Niels, and a contact we used for document transit. The transit contact died 8 years ago. Natural causes. She paused on that. Apparently, Cale and Niels, both of whom were with me at the estate tonight, both of whom would have had to arrange the document placement years in advance because Mote's acquisition of those fragments goes back at least 6 years, Lenora said. I know his acquisition timeline. He referenced the fragments in a footnote in a paper published in 2020. That was the first time they appeared in his bibliography. The room was quiet. Niels was at the equipment bank, his back to them, running the comparison protocol. His shoulders were in the light. His hands were moving across the keyboard. Seraphine's eyes were on his back. Lenora watched Seraphine's eyes. You should ask him, Lenora said quietly. Yes, Seraphine said. She didn't move. Something crossed her face then. Not the grief from the ballroom, not the operational blankness. Something older than both of those. The specific expression of someone who has spent enough time building structures of loyalty and trust to know exactly what the weight of them feels like when they shift. I have known Niels Farron for 16 years. I know. He was at the clinic in Delaney County with me, the night Elise died. Her voice was flat. He was the one who found the patient record. He was the one who told me there was only one infant listed, stillborn. Lenora let that sit, let it find its own shape in the air between them. Seraphine's jaw moved, once, the muscle in it pulling tight and releasing. He would have seen the same record I saw. If there was a second entry, if someone had begun documenting a second child before the record was altered, she stopped. She stood up. Niels, he turned. His expression was the same focused, functional expression it had been for the last hour. He looked at her and then at Lenora, and he read something in the space between them, because he was the kind of person who read spaces, who had survived by reading them, and his face changed. Not into guilt, not into fear, into something that was almost in its own terrible way, relief. How long? Seraphine said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the equipment and picked up the sealed medical case and held it, just held it, and the gesture was so similar to the way Seraphine had held it in the car that Lenora felt something cold move through her chest. She asked me not to tell you, Niels said, until she was sure. She. Seraphine's voice was a wire pulled to its limit. She. Elise. He set the case back down carefully with both hands. She made contact 8 months before the clinic. She'd found something in Reeves' financial architecture, something she hadn't expected, and she was frightened in a way I hadn't seen her frightened before. She came to me instead of you because she thought... He stopped. She thought you'd shut the operation down. Pull her out. She wasn't wrong. I would have. No apology in it, no inflection of any kind. I would have pulled her the moment I knew she was pregnant. She knew that, so she came to me. He turned fully around. He was tired. Lenore could see it now, the kind of tired that had been building for a very long time and had only just been given permission to show. She told me about the twins. She told me about the second entry that had been made and then altered. She told me that if something happened to her, she needed someone to know that both children had existed, that one of them might still exist somewhere. She needed someone to... His voice broke slightly. Reset. She needed a record to survive, something that would surface eventually, in the right place, in front of the right people. You built the provenance chain, Lenora said. I found Mott because Elise had cited his work. She respected him, trusted his methods. Niels looked at Lenora, and there was something in his face now that was different from how he'd looked at her before. Heavier, like a debt being acknowledged. I built the chain over 4 years, routed the fragments through 3 intermediary collections before they reached him, made sure the authentication would hold under scrutiny. He paused. I wanted to tell you, he said to Seraphine, every year since. I wanted to tell you that she was more careful than even you knew, that she had planned for the possibility that she wouldn't... He stopped again. Seraphine said nothing. The silence in the room was the kind of silence that had mass, that pressed against the walls. Then Seraphine said, the father. Her voice was very quiet. You know who he is? Niels's expression changed again. The tiredness shifted into something more specific. Yes. Tell me. Seraphine, tell me. He looked at her for a long moment, then, the contact Elise had built inside Reeves' financial operations. The one who gave her access to the transaction records. He paused. It wasn't an accident, the relationship. She didn't plan it, but it wasn't... She made a choice. She thought it would hold. She thought he was... His name, Niels. Reeves' son, Niels said. Elise's daughters are Magnus Reeves' biological grandchildren. The equipment bank hummed. Somewhere in the wall, something mechanical cycled through a routine operation and returned to silence. Lenora sat at the table and felt the specific quality of a world rearranging itself around a fixed point. The feeling was not unfamiliar. She had felt it before, at 8 years old, when a social worker had sat across from her in a room that smelled like photocopier ink and told her that the family she'd been placed with would not be keeping her. The feeling of the architecture of your life proving, once again, that it had been built on assumptions that weren't load-bearing. Magnus Reeve, who had sent men to the estate tonight to find her, who had ordered whatever was happening in that ballroom, who had spent 22 years making sure a certain set of records stayed buried, not just because Elise had documented his operations, because Elise had also been carrying proof that his son had broken every boundary of operational security and personal loyalty that Reeves' world was built on. Because 2 children existed who were both evidence of that breach, and if they ever understood what they were, potential inheritors of everything Elise had spent 6 years building. Lenora looked at Seraphine. Seraphine was looking at the door. Not the door they'd come in through, the other one, the one the driver had gone through and not returned from. Seraphine, Lenora said. Seraphine turned. Something was wrong with her face. The color of it. The quality of the stillness in it. She took 2 steps toward the door, and it opened from the other side. The driver stood in the doorway. Behind her, visible over her shoulder in the room beyond, were 2 men. Neither of them worked for Seraphine. The driver's expression was the expression of someone who had made a choice a long time ago and had been waiting for the moment when the choice would be collected. I'm sorry, the driver said. She was looking at Niels when she said it. Not at Seraphine, at Niels. They have Kyle. Seraphine's hand moved toward her jacket. Don't, the driver said, and behind her one of the 2 men raised something in his right hand that settled the question of whether this was a negotiation or the man behind the driver had a gun. Lenora registered this the way she registered everything now, fast, flat, without the luxury of a reaction. Her body had stopped asking permission before responding. Somewhere between the tunnel and the car in this room, it had made a decision to stay functional regardless of what her mind was doing with the information. Seraphine's hand was still inside her jacket. Both hands, the man said. He was calm. The calm of someone following a protocol rather than making real-time decisions. That made him more dangerous, not less. People making real-time decisions could be reasoned with. People following protocols had already been reasoned with by someone else earlier and had agreed. Seraphine brought her hands out, empty. She held them slightly away from her body, and her face was the blankest Lenora had seen it. The second man came around the driver and moved to Seraphine's right side. He was younger than the first, heavier, and he had the slightly forward-leaning posture of someone who expected to have to move quickly and had positioned himself accordingly. He reached inside Seraphine's jacket and removed the gun there, compact, dark, and stepped back with it. Then he looked at Lenora. Hands on the table. She put her hands on the table. He crossed to her anyway and patted down her sides, her back, the portfolio she'd set down, and found nothing because she had nothing. She was a librarian. She didn't carry weapons. The idea had never once occurred to her as something she should be doing, and the fact that it occurred to her now, in this room, with the cold, flat weight of regret that accompanied all the things that made sense too late, she pushed it down, hands flat on the table, looking straight ahead. Niels hadn't moved from the equipment bank. He stood with his hands visible at his sides, and the expression on his face had gone into a place Lenora couldn't read. Some internal room he'd retreated to, something old and practiced. The driver hadn't moved from the doorway. "Sit," the first man said. To Seraphine. Seraphine sat. Not quickly, not with any of the compliance of someone who had accepted the situation, with the specific, deliberate slowness of someone buying time in the smallest increment available. The first man pulled out a phone. He made a call without speaking, held it for 3 seconds, ended it, replaced the phone. 15 minutes, he said to the second man. Transport. They were waiting for transport. Seraphine's eyes moved to the driver. How long? She said. Were you carrying this? The driver, her name, Lenora realized, she had never learned, looked at the wall. Not at Seraphine. The wall. Answer me. 2 years. Flat. Not apologetic, not defiant, just the fact. They have Kale, Seraphine said. You said. They picked him up at the north exit, before he could reach the disturbance point. The driver's voice was careful, contained. He's alive. That's what they told me. What they told you? Yes. Seraphine looked at her for a long moment and then looked away, and whatever she did with that information, she did somewhere Lenora couldn't see. Lenora was looking at the equipment bank. The comparison protocol was still running. She could see the progress indicator from where she sat. A thin line of light on the screen, moving slowly across its track. The sealed medical case was on the counter beside the terminal. Everything Niels had built over 6 years, every piece of the chain he'd constructed to bring this moment into existence, was in this room, and in 14 minutes it was going to be walked out through that door. She looked at the first man. He was positioned near the entrance to the main door, the one that led outside. The second man was between Seraphine and the equipment bank, covering the room's center. The driver was still in the doorway to the back room. 3 points. Triangulated coverage without being perfect. The gap was between Niels and the wall equipment, a narrow angle that the second man was almost covering but not quite, because his attention was weighted towards Seraphine, because Seraphine was the threat they'd been briefed on. Not the librarian. Nobody ever briefed on the librarian. She looked at the equipment, at the terminal, at the comparison protocol running. Her memory was the thing Dr. Mott had said distinguished her. In the first year she'd worked with him, he'd tested it informally, the way academics did, citing passage and author and asking her to complete the reference. And she'd completed them, everyone, because she didn't read things and forget them. She read things, and they stayed. The structure of what she'd read, the organization of it, the way the parts connected. She had read Dr. Motta's notes on the DNA comparison protocol when he'd first acquired the equipment. She had read the technical documentation he'd printed and left on his desk. She had read it in the way she read everything that crossed her field of vision, completely, without consciously deciding to. She looked at the terminal. She looked at the second man's position. She looked at Seraphine. Seraphine was looking at the table. Her hands were flat on it, mirroring Lenora's without having planned to, but her eyes, beneath their downward angle, were moving, reading the room, doing the same calculation Lenora was doing. Lenora shifted her right hand slightly on the table surface. Seraphine's eyes moved to it. Lenora looked at the terminal. A small movement, barely a change in the direction of her gaze, then back to the table. Seraphine's jaw moved once. Something passed between them that had no language and didn't need one. The compressed communication of two people who were both looking at the same geometry and had independently reached the same conclusion. Lenora said, "I need to use the bathroom." The first man looked at her. "No. I'm not going to be transported anywhere for the next..." She looked at the ceiling the way people did when they were estimating 12 minutes without using a bathroom. "I've been running through tunnels in a torn dress for the last 40 minutes. This is not a negotiation tactic. This is biology." The first man looked at the second man. The second man shrugged, minimally. The first man looked at the driver. "Back room has a bathroom?" "Yes." He looked at Lenora. "You." He gestured to the driver. "Take her." The driver moved from the doorway into the room. She crossed toward Lenora, and Lenora stood from the chair, and they moved together toward the doorway to the back room, and the second man's position shifted, fractionally, to track them. His back was now at a 30-degree angle to the equipment bank. Seraphine moved, not toward him, toward the table itself, flipping it upright onto its edge in one motion, the flat surface coming up as a barrier, and she was behind it before the first man had completed turning, and the table absorbed the first shot from his gun, a sound that compressed the air in the room into something solid, and Lenora stopped being a person who watched things and became a person who moved. She was already past the driver. She hit the equipment bank at a run and got both hands on the terminal and found the function she needed. She had read the documentation. She had read it. The emergency data transfer protocol, external drive, 4 keystrokes. She got the drive Niels had been using earlier, and the port was where the documentation said it would be, and she hit the first 2 keys. Behind her the room was noise, a surface sound of controlled chaos, the table moving, a body hitting the floor, the driver shouting something. And Lenora was aware of all of it, the way you were aware of weather when you were running through it, present but not primary. 3rd key. Something hit her from the left side and she went into the equipment rack, and her shoulder took the impact, and the pain was immediate and specific, the kind that narrowed everything down to the point of it. The second man had crossed the room. He had her left arm and was pulling her back from the terminal, and she twisted against the pull because the 4th key was there, and the drive needed 2 more seconds. She got the 4th key. Transfer initiated. He yanked her backward, and she let herself go with it rather than against it because fighting the direction of the force was less efficient. And she came around with her right elbow and caught him across the side of the face. Not hard enough to do real damage, but hard enough to buy a half second. And she took the drive from the port. He had her again. Properly this time, both arms from behind. Lenora stopped fighting, because Seraphine was there. She didn't have her gun. The second man still had it somewhere, but she had something she'd picked up from the floor that Lenora didn't see clearly, and she used it against the back of the second man's knee with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested she'd done this exact thing before. And he went down and took Lenora with him, but loosely, his grip breaking on the way, and Lenora hit the floor on her side and kept the drive in her fist. The first man was against the wall. Niels was holding the gun he'd taken off the equipment counter. Not his own, the one the second man had set down to move. And Niels had seen it, and Niels had apparently decided that 16 years of whatever, he was built the capacity for this, because he was holding it with the steadiness of someone who had held guns before. The driver was on the floor near the doorway, conscious, hands pressed against a cut on her forehead, not moving. The room had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that came after sound, that carried the memory of sound in it. Seraphine straightened up. She looked at the first man against the wall. She looked at Niels. She looked at Lenora on the floor. "Get up," she said to Lenora. "Not unkind. The way you said something to someone you needed functional." Lenora got up. Her shoulder was burning. The dress was finished, torn now at the hip from the rack impact, and damp from the tunnel floor and the wet grass, and she was barefoot because she'd lost a shoe somewhere in the last 30 seconds. She didn't remember when. She held up the drive. Seraphine looked at it. "Full comparison protocol was only 30% complete," Niels said from across the room. His voice was even. He was still holding the gun on the first man. The transfer got the raw sample data and the partial results. We can reconstruct the analysis elsewhere. The case? Seraphine said. Lenora picked it up from the counter, still sealed. We have... Seraphine looked at the phone she'd recovered from somewhere in the last 2 minutes. 7 minutes before the transport arrives. Maybe less if what happened in this room triggered any signal. The driver's phone, Niels said. Seraphine crossed to the driver and crouched beside her and took the phone from her jacket pocket. The driver didn't resist. She was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had run their calculation and arrived at an answer they couldn't do anything about. Where's the transport coming from? Seraphine said to her. The driver said nothing. Where? Silence. Seraphine stood. She looked at the phone's screen, locked, and looked at the first man against the wall, and then she made a decision that she communicated to the room by simply moving toward the door. We take the car, she said. North Road. There's a secondary contact 40 kilometers out. Reeve doesn't know about him. He predates Reeve's involvement with my operations by 6 years. Niels crossed the room. He stopped in front of the equipment bank and looked at the terminal and at the transfer confirmation on screen, and something moved across his face that was neither relief nor grief, but the complicated territory between. The full comparison results would have... He stopped. We have the raw data, Lenora said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. I can reconstruct the analysis. I read Mott's documentation on the protocol. I know what the parameters should be. She looked at the drive in her hand. 60% of a 6-year plan is not nothing. Niels looked at her. The thing in his face resolved, finally, into something she could name. It was the thing a person's face did when they had spent a very long time carrying something they shouldn't have been carrying alone and had just been, unexpectedly, helped. They went out through the back room, through a utility entrance, into the dark yard where the car was still parked. Seraphine took the driver's position. Niels took the front passenger side. Lenora got in the back and pulled the door, and before it had fully closed, Seraphine had the engine running and they were moving, gravel loud under the tires, headlights off until they hit the tree line. They drove fast. Lenora held the drive in her right fist and the sealed case in her left, and she looked out at the road unspooling in the headlights, and she let her shoulder hurt because there was nothing to do about it, and denial was expensive. She thought about Magnus Reeve. She had a face now, attached to the name, the silver-haired man from the third table, the one who had watched her lecture with the particular attention of someone who had recognized something they thought was safely buried, the philanthropist, the foundation donor, the man whose name was on hospital wings and university endowment funds, who had spent 30 years manufacturing wars and profiting from what they destroyed, whose son had loved Elise Arden, or something close to love, close enough that Elise had let it matter. Lenora's daughters, Seraphine had said, and one of those daughters was sitting in this car with a stolen drive and a sealed medical case and a shoulder that was going to bruise to the bone by morning. She thought about Dr. Mott. She thought about the way he'd sounded on the phone, the specific quality of fear in a voice that had never been afraid of academic things, never uncertain when the question was historical, perfectly calibrated when speaking about the dead. Afraid like that, in that voice, meant something was happening to him in the present tense. She thought about his footnote in the 2020 paper, the first time the fragments appeared. He had cited them carefully, as preliminary material pending full authentication. He would have known from the moment Niels's provenance chain reached him that the material was exceptional. He would have known it was dangerous. He had authenticated it anyway, because that was what he did. Because his entire life had been built on the proposition that true things deserve to exist in the record regardless of what their existence cost. He had sent her tonight because he couldn't go himself. He had sent her because he wanted a witness, because he had known or suspected that after tonight he might not be one. Seraphine, don't. I know what you need. Her voice from the front seat was flat, and I understand it. And we cannot stop. Lenora pressed her back against the seat. The road was dark and empty and fast. They drove for 22 minutes before the lights appeared behind them. Not ordinary headlights. The positioned brightness of a vehicle running fast with intent. The kind that didn't sit in the ambient pattern of late-night rural traffic but sat above it, deliberate, closing. Seraphine saw it. Of course she saw it. She'd been watching the mirror since they left the farm. "Nils," she said, "I see it. Distance. Closing, fast vehicle. Maybe a kilometer back, kilometer and a half." Seraphine's driving changed. Not dramatically, but measurably. The car found more of the road, the line through curves tightening. She was not panicking, she was calculating, the way she did everything, but the calculation had compressed and Lenora could feel it in the G-force of each turn. "The contact," Lenora said. "How far?" 23 kilometers. The vehicle behind them was a kilometer back, maybe less. 23 kilometers was not a number that worked in their favor. "Is there another option?" Lenora said. Seraphine didn't answer immediately. That was an answer. "There's a junction," Nils said. He was on his phone looking at something. 11 kilometers. Left takes us to the motorway. Faster, but exposed. Right takes us into the old industrial district. Kellard Yard, it's abandoned. Decommissioned rail terminus. "Cover," Seraphine said. "Yes, and no exit road. One way in." Lenora thought about that. One way in means one way out. Yes. And they'd know that. "Yes," Seraphine said. "Sometimes there is no good option. There is only the option that gives you the most control over the terms of what happens next." She glanced in the mirror. "The motorway puts them behind us in open ground at vehicle speed. We lose that race. Kellard Yard puts us in terrain I can navigate, and they can't predict. Because you know it. Because I was the one who decommissioned it." A pause. 11 years ago, for reasons unrelated to tonight. The lights behind them were closer. Lenora looked at the drive in her hand, at the sealed case, at the back of Seraphine's head, the set of her neck, the controlled precision of her hands on the wheel. She thought about everything in the drive, the raw sample data, the partial comparison results, the fragments of Elise's archive that Nils had spent 6 years routing through academic channels to reach this point. Everything that Elise had spent 6 years inside Reeves' organization documenting. Everything she had died to preserve. She thought about Reeve at the third table, already texting before she'd finished speaking. He'd had 23 years to build contingencies, to own people, buy positions, make himself untouchable by making himself useful to enough people that removing him would cost more than tolerating him. He had done it across 4 continents. He had done it to criminal organizations sophisticated enough to have survived long enough to have enemies and learn from them. And all of it. Every transaction, every manufactured conflict, every name and account number and chain of custody was documented in the material Elise had compiled, which was on a drive in Lenora's fist. Lenora was not a woman who had ever wanted power. She had wanted quiet. She had wanted shelves of books in a specific order and children finding stories, and the clean satisfaction of a question correctly answered. She had wanted a life that made sense when you looked at it straight on. That life was behind her now. Not ahead, not recoverable tonight. Maybe not recoverable at all in the same form. Something had ended in the ballroom when Seraphine's glass hit the floor and the tears came that never came. And something else had been building since then through tunnels and dark fields, and a room where the person she'd trusted had been sitting on a secret for 16 years. Not out of betrayal, but out of love for a dead woman, which was the kind of betrayal you couldn't be angry at and couldn't be forgiven for because it existed in the space where loyalty and grief had become the same thing. She was Elise Arden's daughter. She didn't know what that meant yet. She didn't know what it required of her. She didn't know if the comparison protocol, reconstructed from partial data, would produce a result clean enough to constitute proof. What she knew was the drive. What she knew was the case. What she knew was that the material inside them was the thing Magnus Reeve had spent 23 years and untold resources trying to make sure no one ever held in their hands. She was holding it in her hands. The junction came up fast in the headlights. A fork, a sign, the left arm pointing toward the distant glow of motorway lights on the horizon, the right arm going dark into the industrial sprawl of whatever Kellard Yard was in the dark. Seraphine took the right without slowing. The vehicle behind them took it 40 seconds later. The road into the yard was broken asphalt, cracked into plates by years of frost and abandonment, and the car moved over it with a violence that rattled everything inside, and Lenore braced against the door and kept her fists closed. Buildings appeared in the headlights, long, low-roofed industrial structures. The shapes of old loading equipment rusted into silhouettes, rail infrastructure standing in the dark like the skeleton of something enormous. Seraphine killed the lights. She navigated by memory. The car slowed but didn't stop, moving between structures with the confidence of something guided from inside rather than from what she could see. Lenora looked out the window at darkness and the shapes of things she couldn't quite make out. They stopped. A building on their left, close enough that opening the door would put you against the wall. On their right, a structure with open bays. The darkness inside it absolute, the kind that had depth. "Inside," Seraphine said. They got out. The air smelled of rust and old diesel, and something organic, vegetation finding its way through the concrete. Gravel underfoot, then the hollow sound of a floor. Not concrete, something older, wooden perhaps over steel. Lenora moved with the others by sound, by the proximity of their breathing, by the faint heat of another body. The pursuing vehicle's headlights swept across the yard entrance. Visible from here, searching. They had one vehicle. 2 men, maybe 3. Seraphine crouched in the dark. Lenora crouched beside her and could feel the focused stillness coming off her like a temperature. Something that radiated from a person when they had compressed all of their attention into a single operational point. "The drive in the case," Seraphine said. Barely a sound. Lenora put both in her hands. Seraphine put them inside her jacket. "Whatever happens in the next 15 minutes," she said, "those leave this yard, regardless of what that requires." "What does that require?" "From me. Everything I'm capable of." She paused. "From you. Stay in this building. Don't move until you hear my voice. Not someone else's. Mine. And if I don't hear your voice..." The headlights outside swept closer. The pursuing vehicle was moving slowly through the yard, the beams sweeping systematically, the patient geometry of a search. Seraphine looked at her through the dark. "Then you find a way out of this building," she said, "and you get those files to someone who can do something with them. You have your memory. You have everything Elise's journal contains because you read it, and you don't forget things you've read." Her voice was absolutely level. "You are not just a librarian, Lenora. You're the only living person who carries Elise Arden's complete archive in their head." Lenora felt the weight of that land in her chest. "I didn't read the complete archive. I read the fragments Mott had." "The fragments Mott had," Seraphine said, "are the core documentation. The rest is corroborating material. The core is enough." The sweep of the headlights came closer. Seraphine's hand found Lenora's arm in the dark, briefly, with a pressure that was neither directive nor apologetic, but simply present. The touch of someone acknowledging that the moment was real. Then she was gone. Lenora crouched in the dark of the old building and listened to her own heartbeat and the sound of the searching vehicle and Niels's breathing somewhere to her left, and she held herself still with the same quality of stillness she had learned in 8 different homes. The stillness of someone who had survived by making themselves invisible in rooms where being visible was dangerous. Outside, the headlights stopped moving. A door opened, footsteps on gravel, and somewhere in the dark of the Kellard yard, moving between the bones of decommissioned machinery that she had dismantled herself 11 years ago, and therefore knew in the dark the way you knew the geography of a place you had made, Seraphine Voss was. Seraphine moved through the dark like she belonged to it. Not fast, not reckless. The way water moved through a known channel, finding the path by memory and gravity, and the accumulated knowledge of having been here before, in this specific dark, between these specific shapes of rusted steel and collapsed infrastructure. She had walked this yard 11 years ago with a clipboard and a decommissioning crew, and she had mapped it the way she mapped everything she intended to control, completely, without assuming she would never need the map again. The searching vehicle had stopped near the yard's central clearing. 2 men out. She had counted the door sounds. 2. She moved along the eastern wall of the main storage structure, keeping the wall to her left, her right hand trailing at waist height to read the variations in the surface. The jut of a bracket, the recess of a loading bay door, the gap where two sections of wall had separated over the years and left a space wide enough to move through sideways. She went through it. The interior of the secondary structure was open, a transfer hall, she remembered it, long and high-ceilinged, built to accommodate the movement of freight containers. The floor was rail track, inset. The sleepers rotted away, but the steel lines still there. She stepped over the first one without looking. Behind her, outside, the sweep of a flashlight. She stopped. The light was moving along the eastern exterior wall, coming in her direction. The man holding it was doing what she would have done, checking the wall for gaps, for evidence of entry, building a picture of the space before committing to it. Professional. Reeves' people were always professional. That had been the frustration of him over the years. He hired well, paid well, maintained the loyalty that came from consistent competence rather than fear. The men who worked for him stayed because leaving was costly, not because staying was dangerous. It was a more sustainable model than most, and she had acknowledged this to herself, privately, while despising everything it was used in service of. The light found the gap in the wall, stopped on it. Seraphine was 8 meters inside the transfer hall, in the dark, not moving. The light moved through the gap and began crossing the floor. She went right, toward the rail equipment still standing at the hall's far end. An old crane assembly, its arm angled down, cables hanging in loops from the head of it. She put herself behind the base of the crane, and the light crossed through the space she'd just vacated. The man came through the gap. She could hear him now, his breathing, his footsteps on the metal floor, the slight ring of boot on steel rail. He was moving carefully. The light swept in arcs. He was good. He was also alone in a building she knew better than he did. She waited until the light was moving away from her position, angled toward the far left wall, and she moved from the crane base in the window of his inattention. 3 steps, 4, close enough to smell the fabric of his jacket. The thing she'd taken from the floor of the farmhouse, a steel-shafted tool, something Niels had left near the equipment bank. She hadn't looked at it closely enough to identify it, but it had the right weight and the right length. She brought it across the back of his knee, the same way she'd used it in the farmhouse, because knees were reliable, and she had learned this from a woman who had learned it from someone before her. He went down. The flashlight hit the floor and spun. She was on him before he found the ground, controlling the arm that held the gun. He hadn't fired, because going down fast and unexpected didn't leave you time to fire before something instinctive made you try to catch yourself. And she put her weight on his wrist, and the gun left his hand, and then she hit him once, precisely, with the steel shaft, and he stopped moving. She picked up the gun, checked it, chambered. She picked up the flashlight, turned it off. 1. The second man was outside. She had heard one door open, but the vehicle might have held more. She didn't know yet. She moved back toward the gap in the wall and pressed herself against the interior surface and listened. Footsteps on gravel, moving away from the vehicle toward the main structure. The second man was doing what good operators did when their partner went into a building and didn't immediately report out. He was closing in to support rather than calling out across the yard and giving away his position. Smart. She waited. He reached the gap, paused outside it. She could see the thin line of ambient yard light through the gap's edge, the slight change in it when his body blocked part of the opening. Marsh, he said, quiet. Aimed at the interior. Nothing from Marsh. The second man came through the gap. He came through fast and low and to the right, which was the correct entry if you knew what you were doing, and she was already to the right of the gap in anticipation of this because she had worked with enough good operators to know what good operators did, and the gun she'd taken from Marsh was in her right hand, and when he came through, she put the barrel against his neck and said, "Don't." He went very still. Good operators also knew when they were finished. "The vehicle," she said. "How many?" A pause, considering the value of not answering versus the cost of it. 2, he said. "Just us." "Who sent you?" Another pause, shorter. "You know who sent us." "I want to hear you say it." "Reeve." Flat, professional to the end. "Magnus Reeve. We were staging at the eastern approach, standing order. If the farm was compromised, intercept anyone leaving." He anticipated the farm being compromised. He anticipated everything. He always anticipates everything. Something in the voice that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite resentment, but lived in the territory between. That's why people work for him. And yet, she said. He said nothing. And yet you're here with a gun at your neck and your partner on the floor, and Reeve is somewhere else being anticipated at. She stepped back, keeping the barrel on him. Get your partner up. Both of you go to the vehicle. Drive east. Don't stop. A pause. And if we don't, then I demonstrate that I also anticipate things. She let that sit. You were told tonight that this was a containment operation, that the target was a woman who had stumbled into something she didn't understand and needed to be removed before she could complicate it further. She watched the shape of him in the dark. You were not told what she actually carries, what she actually knows. Because if you had been told, you would understand that removing her is not a solution for Reeve. It's a delay. The material exists, the record exists. Every name in his operation exists in documentation that is now held by people who are not in this yard. She paused. So you can drive east, or you can continue this, and the only thing that changes is how it ends for you personally. The outcome for Reeve is identical. The second man breathed. Once, twice. Get Marsh up, she said. He went to Marsh. Seraphine stood in the dark of the transfer hall and listened to them go. Marsh ambulatory but unsteady. The second man with his arm, their footsteps on gravel moving toward the vehicle. She tracked the sound until she heard the doors, the engine, the crunch of the vehicle reversing, and then the headlights sweeping the yard entrance and going dark as they hit the main road. She stood in the dark for another 30 seconds after the sound was gone. Then she walked back through the gap in the wall, across the yard, to the building where she'd left Lenora and Niels, and she stood in the entry and said her name once, clearly, at normal volume. Lenora stood up from the floor. Niels stood up beside her. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing efficient to say, and Seraphine had long ago trained herself to value efficiency over the social rituals that surrounded dangerous situations. She handed the flashlight to Niels. She looked at Lenora. Lenora's face in the backwash of the flashlight beam was bruised down one side from the equipment rack, her shoulder pulled slightly high in the way of something protecting itself from pain, the borrowed dress destroyed at the hem and the hip. She was holding herself with the specific uprightness of someone who has decided they are not going to let their body's damage change their posture. Seraphine recognized this quality. She had recognized it since the ballroom. The vehicle's gone, Seraphine said. We have the car. I need to know, right now before we move, whether the partial comparison data on the drive is sufficient for what you described. Lenora said, Give me the drive in 40 minutes with a terminal. Seraphine gave her the drive. They went back to the car. The secondary contact was a man named Vero, who operated from a converted warehouse 38 kilometers north, and who had known Seraphine long enough and well enough to open the door at 2 a.m. without asking questions he'd get answers to anyway. He had equipment. He had a first aid kit that Lenora used on her shoulder in a bathroom that smelled like solvent while Niels set up the terminal in the main space. She came out of the bathroom with her arms strapped and the dress replaced with clothes Vero had produced, plain, too large, functional, and she sat at the terminal and she worked. 40 minutes, as promised. The partial comparison data was 60% of the full protocol, which was not ideal but was sufficient for the purpose she was using it for, because the purpose wasn't a court of law. The purpose was a room full of people who had heard Elise Arden's words spoken aloud for the first time in 22 years, and who were, at this moment, in the aftermath of a gala that had turned into something considerably different than the event they'd attended, making calculations about what they knew and what it was worth and what they wanted to do with it. What Lenora was building was not proof in the legal sense. It was a record, complete, sourced, cross-referenced, with the partial comparison data appended as supporting material, and the chain of provenance documented from Elise's original compilation through Niels's 6-year routing through the academic archive system to the university collection to Dr. Mott's hands to hers. She wrote it the way she organized everything, from the foundation up, every source cited, every link in the chain accounted for, no claim made that the evidence didn't support, no gap papered over with assertion. The kind of document that could survive scrutiny because it had been built for scrutiny, because the person who built it had spent her entire working life understanding that a record only protected what it claimed to protect if it could withstand every attempt to discredit it. Niels watched her work for a while and then stopped watching, not because it wasn't worth watching, but because there was something in the focused completeness of it that required privacy in the way that grief required privacy. Not an audience, just the room and the work and the person doing it. Seraphine sat at a table against the far wall and made calls. Not many. 5. Each one short. She was calling in things that had been owed her for a long time, collecting debts in the currency of information rather than money. And the people she called answered because it was Seraphine Voss calling at 2 in the morning, which was the kind of call that you answered or you spent the rest of your operational life wondering what you'd missed. By 3 in the morning, the document existed. Lenora saved it to the drive. She saved it to a secondary drive Varro provided. She sent it through a routed connection Niels set up in 15 minutes to 4 separate locations. A journalist whose name appeared in Elise's original documentation as a potential outside contact, a financial crimes analyst in a jurisdiction where Reeve had significant exposure, an attorney who specialized in international asset recovery, and the secure server of one of the syndicate families whose name appeared most prominently in Reeve's manufactured conflict files. The last one was Seraphine's edition. They were the primary target of the war he manufactured in 2009, she said, when Lenora looked at her. They lost 140 people. They have been trying to understand the origin of that conflict for 15 years. This gives them the answer. She paused. It also gives them a reason to want Reeve's organization to collapse before he can use them against each other again. Lenora sent it. She sat back in the chair and her shoulder told her immediately and loudly about the cost of sitting back in a chair when you had been bounced off an equipment rack 4 hours ago, and she breathed through it and waited for it to settle to something she could ignore. Dr. Mott, she said. Seraphine looked at her across the room. We need to know. Yes. Seraphine was already standing. Varro has contacts in the city. I've been waiting until we were... She stopped. Until we were past the immediate problem. We're past it. We're past the immediate version of it. She moved toward Varro's back office. Reeve still exists. What we sent tonight makes his position untenable in every organization he's embedded in, but untenable doesn't mean gone. He has money and infrastructure and people who don't yet know what's happened tonight. He will spend the next 72 hours trying to control the information. She looked back at Lenora. But he will also know after tonight that the primary record is out of reach. That changes what he's willing to risk to recover it. She went into the back office. Lenora looked at the terminal, at the document she'd built in 40 minutes that contained 22 years of accumulated damage. Niels came and sat across from her. He had his hands around a coffee mug that Varro had produced at some point, and he looked like a man who had been awake for so many consecutive hours that sleep had become an abstract concept, the way things became abstract when you'd lived past them long enough. You should know, he said, that I have waited a long time for tonight. I know. Not the way tonight happened. I had a version of it, cleaner. A conference presentation, academic channels, everything surfacing slowly through legitimate networks with distance enough between Seraphine and the material that she wouldn't be exposed. He looked at the mug. It did not occur to me that Reeve would have someone inside Mott's university, that they would move on Mott before the Gala rather than after. You couldn't account for everything. Elise could have. He said it without self-pity, just the factual weight of it. She would have. Lenora looked at him. You loved her. Yes. Simple. No qualifier. For 11 years. And she loved me the way you love someone when you love someone else more, completely, but not exclusively, and not in the way that rearranges everything else. He drank the coffee. I was at peace with it. Mostly. And the father, his jaw tightened. Reeve's son, Dorian Reeve. He was nothing like his father. That was the point and also the problem. He was inside the organization, but genuinely uncomfortable inside it. He was looking for a reason to leave, or a way to burn it down, and Elise was both those things to him. He paused. He died in 2008, a year after Elise. An accident, officially. I have believed for 15 years that it was his father's doing, and I have had no way to prove it. Lenora thought about this. The family she had been told she didn't have. The man who had been her father without knowing she existed. The grandfather who had spent 23 years trying to ensure she never found this out. Is there documentation of his identity as the father? Nils looked at her. Elise's personal archive, the portion she gave me directly, not the operational documentation? Yes. She was careful even with that. There's a letter, several. Photographs. He paused. They are in a location only I know. I have not included them in anything sent tonight. Why? Because they are yours. He said it plainly. Not evidence for a case, not material for a record. They are letters from your mother about someone she chose. They are yours to decide what to do with. Lenora sat with this for a long time. The warehouse around them was quiet. The ambient sound of a large, empty space at 3 a.m, the settling of structure, the distant sound of Seraphine's voice from the back office, a single lamp throwing light across the table, and the terminal and the two people sitting on either side of it. She thought about the yellow kitchen with the walls she remembered from before she was 5. She thought about whether that was a real memory or a constructed one, the kind of thing you built in the gap where real memory should be, assembled from photographs and other people's descriptions, and the basic human need to have an origin that made sense. She didn't know. She had never known. She had stopped trying to know. She knew now, at least, that the gap had been made, that someone had taken the original material and destroyed it, and what she'd been living in was the negative space of that destruction. She knew her mother's name. Elise Arden. She knew her mother had been thorough and careful and had looked at a world full of damage and decided, instead of leaving it, to document it, to make a record, to believe that the record mattered even if she didn't survive it. Lenora put both hands flat on the table. She understood. Sitting in this warehouse at 3 a.m. with a strapped shoulder and borrowed clothes and a drive that had just changed the operational landscape of half a dozen criminal organizations across 4 continents, that this was inheritance. Not the formal kind, not what you received from a will or a named estate. The other kind. The thing that passed from one person to another through the quality of how they'd lived, through what they'd chosen to protect when protecting it cost everything. Her mother had been a woman who made records. So was she. Seraphine came back from the office. She stopped in the center of the room. Her face told Lenora something before she said it. He's alive, Seraphine said. Mott. He's in a hospital. They found him this morning in his apartment. He'd been detained, apparently, and released when whoever detained him received word that the gala had proceeded. She paused. He has injuries. Nothing permanent, they're saying. He's conscious. Lenora breathed. The thing in her chest that had been compressed since the phone call at 6 a.m, the cold, specific weight of not knowing, released. Not all the way, but enough. He sent me on purpose, Lenora said. Yes. He knew they might come for him. He knew the passages would be recognized. He sent me because he wanted a witness who wasn't him, who wasn't connected to the academic archive chain, who would be in the room when it happened and who couldn't be disappeared the way he could be because I had no connection to any of this. I was just a librarian who worked for him. She stopped. He was trying to protect the moment, the public moment. Make sure it happened in front of witnesses regardless of what happened to him. Yes, Seraphine said. That is what I believe he was doing. Lenora thought about the footnote in the 2020 paper. The 6-year chain of custody, the way a person could spend decades building toward a single necessary moment, not knowing if they would be present for it. Not unlike her mother. Reeve, she said. Seraphine moved to the table and sat in the third chair, the one that made them a triangle. She put her hands flat in front of her the way she'd done in the study at the estate, the same gesture. Both hands visible, nothing concealed. He is currently in transit. Vero's contacts tracked his vehicle leaving the city an hour ago. He has resources outside the country, accounts, properties, structural positions, and organizations we haven't mapped completely. She paused. What we sent tonight will move faster than he will. The syndicate families will have received it within the hour. The financial analyst I contacted has enough to open an inquiry that will freeze the accounts accessible to him in this jurisdiction. She looked at Lenora. He will not be arrested tonight. He may not be arrested this year. The process of dismantling what he's built will take time, and it will be ugly, and not all of it will be just. But he's finished, Niels said. He's finished as what he was. Seraphine's voice was careful. A man with 30 years of manufactured loyalty has nothing when the loyalty is gone. The families he played against each other now know what he did. The organizations he's embedded in have received documentation of how he used them. He has money, and he has mobility, and he has nothing else. She was quiet for a moment. That has to be enough. For tonight, it has to be enough. Lenora thought about enough, about the texture of it, about how it differed from justice, which was the word she would have used before tonight, before she'd spent several hours inside a world where justice was a direction rather than a destination. She thought about a man sitting in a moving car watching everything he'd built dissolve behind him because a quiet woman in a borrowed dress had stood at a lectern and read from a journal that should not have existed. She thought about her mother choosing to write things down. She thought about Niels choosing to preserve what was written. She thought about Dr. Mott choosing to authenticate fragments he could have declined to acquire. She thought about the chain of it, the long, patient, fragile chain of people deciding one by one that the record mattered. "I want to see them," she said. "The letters. Whatever she left." Niels nodded. "Not tonight," she said, "but soon." "Yes." She looked at Seraphine. "The comparison protocol, the partial data, it's not conclusive." "No." "It's suggestive. It supports the relationship without confirming it at a legal standard." "Yes." "Do you need it to be conclusive? For you?" Lenora held the question in the air between them. "Does it change anything for you, whether the number comes back at 95% or 60? Seraphine looked at her for a long time. She looked at her the way she'd looked at her in the ballroom, across distance, through noise and performance, and the ambient chaos of a world that ran on transaction. The way you looked at something that your body had already identified before your mind was willing to commit. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't change anything for me." Lenora nodded. They sat in the warehouse, and the night moved through its last hours, and none of them slept, and none of them tried to. Varro made more coffee. Niels worked on routing confirmations, verifying that the document had arrived at all 4 destinations. Seraphine made 2 more calls, shorter than the earlier ones, the calls of someone who has done what they needed to do and is now managing what comes after. Lenora sat at the terminal and wrote 1 more document, not the record, not Elise's material. Something else. A personal account, first person, beginning with a phone call at 6 in the morning and a borrowed dress and a gala invitation that wasn't hers, ending in a warehouse at 4 in the morning with a strapped shoulder and a name she hadn't known was hers. Everything she'd seen, everything she'd heard, every conversation, every room, every decision and its cost, written in the precise and comprehensive way she wrote everything she needed to remember, which was also the way she wrote everything because she never needed to work at remembering. She needed only to work at saying. She saved it. She put it on both drives. She thought about her mother writing things down in the middle of 6 years inside a life that wasn't hers, writing things down knowing it might be the only form of survival available, the record instead of the body, the truth instead of the person who had found it. She understood this now in her chest rather than just her mind. The morning came slowly. The warehouse's high windows went from black to gray to the particular washed pale of early light that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. Lenora stood up from the terminal and walked to one of the windows and looked out at the industrial periphery of a city coming awake. The first trucks on the access road, a light going on in a building across the way. The ordinary morning business of a world that had no idea what had happened in it overnight. She heard Seraphine come up beside her. They stood at the window without speaking. The light came up slowly, the way it did in early summer, without drama, simply accumulating until there was enough of it. "What happens to you now?" Seraphine said finally. "I go back to work." Lenora watched a truck pull onto the access road below. "I visit Dr. Mott when he's well enough. I read the letters Niels has." She paused. "Eventually I go back to the library. And the rest of it. The rest of it will still be there when I get to it." She looked at the growing light. "I've been living in a gap for 31 years. I'm not going to fill it in overnight. That's not how gaps work." Seraphine said nothing for a moment. Then, "I should have looked harder." "You didn't know there was anything to look for." I should have considered the possibility. Lenora turned and looked at her. At the precise, expensive architecture of her face in the morning light, the lines that 22 years of a particular kind of life had cut into it. The gray eyes that had cried in a ballroom full of people who had never seen them cry before. You built a provenance chain, Lenora said. You preserved a blood sample for 22 years. You walked into Kellard Yard with a steel tool and no gun and came back out. She held Seraphine's gaze. You looked as hard as you were able, given what you knew. That's all anyone can do. Seraphine's jaw moved, set. It's not absolution, Lenora said. I'm not offering that. I don't know if that's mine to offer, but it's what's true, and I don't say things that aren't true. Something shifted in Seraphine's face. Not resolution. Resolution would take longer than one morning, if it came at all, but a slight release of pressure, the millimeter of change that meant something had been heard. She would have liked you, Seraphine said. Elise. She was always more comfortable with people who didn't say things that weren't true. She found the performance exhausting. A pause. She would have found it funny, actually. Her daughter, a librarian. Why? Because she believed libraries were the only honest institutions left. She said this often. She said it with the specific confidence of someone who had spent 6 years inside every other kind of institution and had data to support the claim. Seraphine's mouth moved almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, the shape of one, briefly, in the morning light. She would have considered it a better outcome than anything she'd planned. Lenora turned back to the window. Below, the city was waking up. The trucks, the lights, the slow accumulation of morning business, a world that would read things in the coming days that would shift its understanding of certain events and certain names without knowing where the information had come from or through what chain of people and choices and costs it had traveled to reach them. She thought about the library, the specific smell of it in the morning before the patrons arrived, old paper and new, the particular silence of a space organized around the idea that what had been written down deserved to last. The children who came on Thursday afternoons, the way a child looked at a story for the first time, the full weight of attention that small bodies were capable of when something caught them completely. She had chosen that life without knowing it was a choice. Without knowing it was the thing her mother would have respected most among all available options. She chose it again now, consciously. 6 months later, on an afternoon in early autumn when the light came through the library windows at the angle that made the dust visible in it, Lenora was shelving returns in the north stacks when she heard the door. She didn't look up immediately. The door was always opening. That was the point of a door on a library. That it opened. The people came through it looking for things they needed. She looked up when this room went slightly quiet, in the particular way of people noticing someone enter who carried, even in a place like this, even dressed plainly, even without the formal architecture of a ballroom around her, the unmistakable quality of being watched. Seraphine Voss stood at the end of the stacks. She was wearing a coat, a dark one, plain. She was carrying something under her arm, a book-shaped package wrapped in brown paper. She looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at her. A child at the table in the middle of the room looked between them with the open assessment of someone too young to pretend not to. Seraphine walked the length of the stacks. She stopped. She held out the package. Lenora took it. She didn't open it. She could feel through the paper the shape of something that was not a standard-bound volume. Something older, the slightly uneven edges of a handmade or hand-restored binding. It took this long, Seraphine said, to have it restored properly. The pages were damaged. Lenora held the package carefully. The complete journal, Seraphine said. Not the fragments, the original. I had been keeping it. She paused. I had been keeping it because I couldn't decide what to do with it, which is not something I experience often and which I handled badly for a very long time. She looked at the package in Lenora's hands. It belongs to the record. It should be somewhere it can be found. Lenora thought about her mother writing in it. The specific intimacy of handwriting, the way it carried the body of the person who had made it even after that person was gone. I'll find it the right place, Lenora said. Seraphine nodded. She looked at the library around them, at the shelves and the morning light and the child at the table, and the ordinary inhabitable quiet of a room built around the proposition that things written down deserved to last. Something moved across her face that Lenora had not seen there before. Not grief, not calculation, not the controlled operational blankness that was Seraphine's default face in a world that ran on threat and counter-threat. Something quieter. The face of a person who has been at war for so long that the cessation of war feels unfamiliar, and who is deciding carefully whether unfamiliar can eventually become inhabitable. Magnus Reeve, Lenora said, in custody as of last week, a jurisdiction with an extradition treaty. Seraphine's voice was level. The syndicate families provided corroborating evidence that made the financial case airtight. The inquiry your analyst opened in March did the rest. She paused. It will take years. The legal process will be everything the legal process is. Slow and imperfect and subject to interference. She looked at Lenora directly. But he's finished. What he was is finished. Lenora nodded. Kale, she said. Home. Something in Seraphine's voice shifted slightly on the word. He was released the night of the gala when Reeves' people recognized their operation had been compromised. He is, she stopped, tired. He is very tired. We all are. Nils. Working. He is always working. He told me to tell you that the letters are whenever you're ready. There's no rush. He means it. Lenora looked at the package in her hands. She thought about ready, about what it meant. Whether it was something you arrived at or something you decided, the way you decided most things that mattered. Not because the conditions were right, but because waiting for the conditions to be right was itself a choice about how to live. She had her mother's name. She had her mother's journal in her hands. She had, on a drive in the back of her desk drawer, a document she had written in a warehouse at 4 a.m. that was the most complete account of a single night she had ever produced. She had the beginning of a past that made sense when you looked at it straight on. Stay, Lenora said. If you want, there's coffee in the back. It's not good coffee, but it exists. Seraphine looked at her. I'm shelving until 4, Lenora said. After that, I have a program. Thursday afternoons, children's stories. You don't have to stay for that, but you can. Something in Seraphine's face moved through its quiet revolution. All right, she said. She found a chair near the window in the space between the north stacks and the reading tables, and she sat in it, and Lenora went back to shelving, and the library did what libraries did. It held the morning light and the ordinary sound of people in proximity to things that had been written down, and it kept being what it was, which was the proposition made physical, the belief made into rooms and shelves, that truth was worth the cost of preserving it. The journal sat on Lenora's cart, brown paper, an old binding, damaged and restored. Everything her mother had known, in her mother's hand, waiting as all records wait, not to be recovered because it had been recovered, waiting only to be read.